Hi everyone. Okay, so welcome back to another history lesson with me, Miss One. So we are going to continue our Unit 6 exploration of imperialism by talking about reform and imperialism in East Asia. So in the last video, we talked a little bit about, what Europe did in Africa. We talked about the expansion of the United States and Japan and Russia. So let's dig a little bit deeper into specific areas. So over the next couple videos, including this one, we're going to look at East and South Asia because, let's be honest, what Europe and the colonizers did to Africa was just as bad as what they did in East and South Asia. So let's explore a little bit what I am talking about. So in this one in particular, we're going to focus on economic imperialism. So in the last video, I talked about the difference between neocolonialism, which was going on in Latin America, which was Britain and the United States heavily investing in Latin America, and then actual imperialism elsewhere. Economic imperialism in particular. So we are going to look at economic imperialism primarily in Asia in these next couple of videos. In this one, we're going to focus heavily on China and the causes of the Opium Wars and where the opium actually came from. So just as a review from the last video, we are talking about the industrializing powers that had established transoceanic empires into other parts of the world, and these industrialized states practiced economic imperialism. So we are focusing on British and the French expansion of their influence into China through the Opium Wars. Now, China was a victim kind of its own earlier successes. So they had a good economy, and American food crops were allowed for massive population growth. No industrial revolution actually accompanying this population growth. It was purely just agricultural production, could not keep up. So they brought in food from elsewhere. Now, China's famed centralized and bureaucratic state also could not keep up with this massive growth. So this resulted in a lot of problems for China. There was this growing pressure on the land and small farmers for peasant populations. There was a large amount of unemployment, there was a large amount of impoverishment, and also starvation. Yeah, you can see where this is growing, or where this is going, right? It's not growing anywhere. So as a result, the central state lost a lot of its power in, the provincial officials and the local gentry. And corruption was a huge, huge problem. So this led to the Taiping Rebellion, which was a revolt against the Qing dynasty, which were the Manchus. Remember that the Qing dynasty was the Manchurians or the Mongols, the ones that, decided to stay and, assimilate into China. So they weren't even real Chinese. And they obviously had some struggles with governing over China. So the result was a lot of peasants were ticked off and decided to rebel. And there was also this wandering band of bandits that didn't help in the matter either. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. Whew, excuse me. So this all culminated, all of these problems resulted in the Taiping Rebellion. So the leaders actually rejected Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. They found their ideology in a unique form of Christianity. And the leading figure of this proclaimed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and that he was actually sent to cleanse the world of demons and establish a heavenly kingdom of great peace. I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm not saying he's crazy, but he very well could be. Because where was that in the Bible? Where was that when I was studying? Jesus Christ had a what? So this is Jesus's Chinese brother. Some people. So the rebellion demands were this. They wanted to abolish private property. They wanted the radical redistribution of land. They wanted equality for both men and women. They wanted to 100% end foot binding and prostitution and opium smoking. They wanted an organization of society into sexually segregated military camps of men and women. They also wanted to denounce the Qing dynasty as foreigners who had poisoned China and defiled the emperor's throne. Oh, yeah, go big or go home. They wanted to reestablish Chinese authority in China while also getting rid of apparently what everybody was enjoying at this time. Well, I don't know anybody who was enjoying foot binding, but they basically just wanted to create this kingdom of God in China that was ruled over by, Chinese people. So these are depictions, paintings, drawings of the Taiping Rebellion. But this is not where it ends. So their demands actually continue. The forces actually established the capital in Nanjing in 1853. It seemed like the Qing dynasty was done. It was over with. But there was this division and indecisiveness within the Taiping leadership, and their inability to kind of link up with other rebel groups led to widespread ineffectiveness. And eventually they were defeated by the provincial gentry, landowners, the ones that they had initially said needed to give up their land. Yeah, they were defeated by those landowners. And these landowners got in the fight because they feared the radicalism of the Taiping program, aka land redistribution. This gentry also had the help of the French and British, who helped the Qing dynasty fight back against the Taiping. Thus, the Qing dynasty was saved, but it was weakened as the provincial gentry actually consolidated their power at the expense of the central state. I do apologize. My dog has gone crazy today. Oh, the opium wars. So these are two graphs that show the correlation between opium and silver. So in China, they actually used silver as their currency. So when silver hit the market, from the New World, they were trying to acclimate it more and more, or not acclimate it, accumulate more and more of the silver. And you start to see that this balance shifts ever so slightly, that the Chinese payments the Chinese payments shifts from surplus to a deficit, just ever so slightly. And that was about the time that, opium was introduced. Yeah. And you can actually see that even though the imperial or the emperor put a ban on opium, it didn't stop the practice. It actually continued to get worse and grow. So let's look at this case study of British imperialism in China, specifically focusing on the Opium Wars. So nowhere was the shifting balance of global power in the 19th century more evident than China's changing relationships with Europe. And this was most dramatically affected by the famous Opium wars. So opium, if you didn't know this, comes from the poppy plant. And the opium actually originated from Arab traders who would take the poppy plant and take the seeds and, make opium out of it. It's like they used to call it poppy milk because it does look a little like milk. This was long used as a drinkable medicine, and it was regarded as a magical cure for dysentery and described as fit for Buddha. Now, dysentery, if you didn't know this, just makes you have to use the bathroom so much that you become dehydrated and end up dying from it. Yeah. Opium actually did not become a problem, like a major drug problem, until the late 18th century when the British used the opium, which was grown and processed in India, to cover their persistent trade imbalance with China. Now, the Chinese were not interested in having any dealings with European manufactured goods. They didn't want anything of it. And that frustrated the British, who had this massive stockpile of metals but had no market. They needed a market, and China was one of the largest untapped markets in the world at this point. So they did try to negotiate with trade, but there was no success. So by the 1830s, the British, the Americans, and other Western merchants had found a very profitable market for this highly addictive drug. Now, from 1,000 chests, that's roughly 150 pounds, in 1773, China's opium imports exploded to 23,000 chests in 1832. Oh, wait, you do the math. Oh, yeah. If you are looking at your phone or your calculator and going, oh my gosh, that's the reaction that you should have. The British had very few exports the Chinese were interested in. They were only interested in the opium and the cotton. And the British imported tea and silk and vermilion and other products in large quantities from China. China didn't need anything. China didn't want anything. The British were the ones that needed it. So they needed to find a way to tip the scale. Opium exportation or opium importation was illegal, but it was being smuggled in, and they bribed corrupt Chinese officials to turn a blind eye to the problem. Now, the outflow of silver to pay for the opium reversed China's centuries-long ability to attract much of the world's silver supply. So silver from China via the opium actually helped fuel industrialization in Great Britain and Europe. And this imbalance caused serious economic problems in China because millions of Chinese became addicted to opium. They refused to do their work. They refused to do their work, and they refused to become actual productive members of society. So what you're looking at in this picture here is a picture of an opium den. It's where you smoke the opium, basically lying down, and then you just chill out. You just hang out. And because of the ecstasy that came from the opium, they just wanted to get high all the time. And as a result, now, if you didn't know this, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Opium is basically heroin, which is basically morphine. That's right. I said it. Morphine, what they give you in the hospital when you have like a particularly bad surgery, that is basically medical grade heroin, which is also just opium. It all comes from the poppy plant. If you hear opium, you hear opioid, it all comes from the same place. It is all highly addictive. And what that actually does to you is if it starts to kill you, it can take like a 20-year-old person and make them look like they are 80 in such a short amount of time. And that's what you're seeing from this picture here. Is they go from having all the nice refinements, nice cushy life, to having literally nothing and being impoverished. So Chinese authorities led a campaign against opium. They began seizing and destroying about 3 million pounds of opium. They expelled Western traders from the country and essentially just closed their door. The British were greatly offended by this violation of property rights and sent a large naval expedition to China. The British wanted to end the restrictive conditions under which they had long traded with China. And this began the First Opium War, which was ended by the Treaty of Nanjing. Now, what I should mention, and if you haven't noticed this yet, is the Chinese were looking at the British going, get the F out. You have destroyed our country. You have caused so many people to become addicted to this drug that they don't even want to work anymore. And we got some work to do here to undo all of this. So get out. And the British were like, bet. And they brought in the guns to force, the British were like, oh no, we making some money off of y'all. Y'all are some suckers. So So the war was actually ended on British terms. Like, the British did this. They were making money hand over fist off of the Chinese. And when China was like, yeah, no, get out, right? The British were like, watch us. So they imposed a number of restrictions on Chinese sovereignty. That's Chinese peace and Chinese ability to govern themselves. And they opened up 5 ports to European traders. The provisions reflected the changed balance of global power that emerged with Britain's Industrial Revolution. Britain also was victorious in the Second Opium War, and the results of this treaty meant that even more ports were opened to foreigners. Foreigners were allowed to travel freely and by land in China. Christianity was allowed under the protection of the Chinese authority, and Chinese were forbidden to use the character for barbarian to refer to the British in official documents. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So we are actually going to look at these documents in class. So what I'm going to do is I am going to skip ahead and we are going to look even more at this case study. So following defeats by the French and the Japanese, China lost control of Vietnam, Korea, and Taiwan. By the end of the 19th century, Western nations plus Japan and Russia had carved out spheres of influence within China and basically granted themselves special privilege to establish military bases, extract raw materials, build railroads, build roads in particular, just basically do whatever they wanted to with Chinese land and Chinese property. And many Chinese people believed that their country was being carved up like a melon. You remember back in Africa, when Africa was being carved up like a pie, well, that was now happening in China. So when I talk about spheres of influence, what I'm talking about are just basically these areas that you have control over, that you can influence. And by you, I mean, countries in this case. It would be British, the French, the German, the Japanese, and the Russian, right? They're the ones controlling these territories, and they're the ones that have the influence in what happens. Yeah, we're going to talk about this one, and I'm going to skip forward. Again, I know, Miss Horn, why are you skipping forward? Well, it's because we are actually going to talk about these in class. So, with the end of the Opium Wars, we start to see the development and spread of what's called global capitalism, which led to a variety of responses. So in Qing China and the Ottoman Empire, some members of the government resisted economic change. They actually attempted to maintain pre-industrial forms of economic production. In a small number of states, however, governments promoted their own state-sponsored vision of industrialization. We saw this in particular when it came to the Meiji in Japan, right? They took pieces of European industrialization and created their own form. And that's essentially what China begins to do in this self-strengthening movement. So the Chinese were not passive when it came to losing the Opium Wars. They were not passive in the face of their country's mounting problems, both internally and externally. In the 1860s and 1870s, they began this quote unquote self strengthening of their policies in order to reinvigorate traditional China while borrowing from the West. So they overhauled their examination system. They provided support for landlords and, to help repair the dikes and irrigation in order to restore rural society and also their economic order. You started to see a few industrial factories like textile and steel. Coal mines were expanded. They initiated a telegraph system, and they also made arsenals and shipyards and also established foreign language schools. So this photo represents this self-strengthening. You start to see this arsenal. This is, cannons. This is also an arsenal, like this is a military base. So this self-strengthening was basically a program to help modernize China. It was inhibited by the fears of conservative leaders who felt that urban, industrial, or commercial developments would erode the power and privileges of the landlord class. But these new industries remained dependent on foreigners for their machinery, materials, and expertise. So while they were trying to self-strengthen, they also had to rely on the outside world. And this is where the Boxer Rebellion comes into play. So general failure of the self-strengthening movement was obvious by the end of the 19th century. This was very much when this anti-foreign, anti-imperialist movement known as the Boxer Rebellion erupted in northern China. It was led by militia organizations that were calling themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. The Boxers killed numerous European and Chinese Christians and led a siege to foreign embassies in Beijing. When Western powers and the Japanese occupied Beijing to crush the rebellion and imposed a huge payment on the Chinese as punishment, it was clear that China would remain dependent on foreign countries and under the power of foreigners. Dun, dun, dun. So this is what colonial powers had carved up in China between 1850 and 1910. You can see that there's very little that is controlled by actual China. Most of the area is controlled by the British, the French, the German, the Japanese, and the Russian. So this failure of conservative modernization in China really disillusioned the Qing dynasty, which was both foreign and ineffective. By the late 1890s, many clubs, study groups, newspapers tried to examine China's desperate situation and explore alternate paths. They admired not only Western science and technology, but also Western political practices that limited the authority of the ruler and permitted wider circles of people to take part in public life. They believed only a truly unified nation in which rulers and ruled were closely related could save China from this dismemberment at the hands of foreign imperialists. And this would create a powerful force of Chinese nationalism. And it directed against both the foreign imperialists and also the foreign Qing dynasty. So the Qing dynasty's response to this new pressure was inadequate. The whole freaking dynasty was inadequate. So more extensive reform in the early 20th century, including the end of the old examination system, the promise of a national parliament, it was little too late. In 1910, the ancient imperial order that had governed China for 2 millennia had completely collapsed. And it was the end of a long era in Chinese cultural and political history and the beginning of a struggle over the nation's future. And this is where Mao Zedong would enter the equation. And that is where I am going to stop for today, because we are going to talk about the other little pieces in class when I see you next. Bye, everyone.